We're going to talk about Donald Trump and the media, which is the announced topic. But we're going to start, when we do begin in a minute, talking about the Court of Appeals decision and where that's likely to go. It's an important decision, not unexpected, but 1 o'clock. Let's get going. This day, this episode, we're going to talk about Donald Trump, and we're going to start by talking about the Supreme Court decision. It's 1 o'clock Eastern time, which means the cable networks are about to hit the top of the hour. And when they do, I want to see what they're covering. It's a little bit complicated because you've got this big news about Donald Trump and the Court of Appeals decision. You also have President Biden, who was supposed to speak 15 minutes ago and will probably speak while we're on here together. You can see Fox is teasing his remarks. MSNBC is talking about the immunity decision by the Court of Appeals. We'll see what CNN starts with. But the president's supposed to speak about this face-off in Congress over the immigration bill and aid to Ukraine and Israel. That's obviously a huge story and obviously relates to Donald Trump. So you see CNN's talking about the immunity question. I'm sure Fox will some too, although it's an adverse decision for the president. So we'll keep monitoring cable, but I just want to, again, set the stage for those of you who haven't checked in on the news. The Court of Appeals, unanimous decision, long decision, very sweeping in favor of Jack Smith's position against Donald Trump's position, saying that there is no immunity for a president committing the kind of alleged criminal acts that Donald Trump committed. That means they basically said, forget appealing to the full Court of Appeals. They said to Trump, you can do it, but the clock's not going to stop while you do. As everybody knows, Judge Chutkan, the district court judge, trial court judge, basically put a hold on all the proceedings while this appellate issue went forward. The Court of Appeals said you have a few days, 6 days or so, to go to the Supreme Court, which Donald Trump has already said he'll do. And so the big question is, what will the Supreme Court do? Will they take the case? If they do take it, will they take it quickly? Possible that they'll just reject it out of hand. They'll say, we're letting the Court of Appeals stand. If they do that, if they let the Court of Appeals decision stand, Judge Chutkan can start going right now, and that would greatly increase the odds, of course, that Donald Trump faces a jury verdict before the election. If the Supreme Court agrees to take it, question will be, how quickly do they do it? The Court of Appeals expedited the front end of their process. They scheduled the arguments. They heard the arguments very quickly. They then waited longer than a lot of people thought they would to actually rule as they did today. So I don't think, most legal scholars don't believe that the Supreme Court will eventually rule in Donald Trump's favor. They could, but I doubt it, and most legal experts agree with that. The big question is, if they rule eventually that way, when will they rule? How quickly will they take up Trump's expected appeal in just a couple of days? So I want to start by turning to our guests who were nice enough to join us and see what they think about the legal and political implications of the Court of Appeals ruling, and I think more importantly, what the Supreme Court might do. So I want to start with Tom Rogers, who knows a lot about a lot, including about stuff like this. So Tom, what's your general view of how likely this makes a trial for Trump in the DC case before the election? How much more likely does it make it?
Well, I have no real prediction as to whether the Supreme Court will take the case or not. The Court of Appeals decision was obviously crafted on a unanimous, what's called per curiam basis, to make sure that there was as much unison among the three judges as possible to make it more possible that the Supreme Court could just let the Court of Appeals decision stand and not take the case. I think it's probably a little more likely than not that they take it, just because it is a huge constitutional issue of first impression, as obvious as it is that if they do take the case, they will decide it against Trump. I think if they do take the case, between briefing schedules, oral argument, whatever time it takes for them to fashion a decision, and there you probably won't have unanimity among the 9 justices, and you probably will have some concurring decisions that are somewhat different. I think if they do take the case, it's hard to see that would be less than a 6-week, maybe a 2-month process, with the 2 months that have already elapsed in terms of the pause that has taken place in the trial court. then you're probably up to 4 months from sometime toward the end of March, and 4 months from the end of March, April, May, June, July. You wouldn't be starting a trial till August. And I think that starting a trial in August is a very, very, very dicey political matter, given that it requires Trump to be in court. So
I agree with everything you said.
That's my view.
I agree with everything you said. And again, if possible, if this were a normal case, because as you said, it's a case of first impression, it's a pretty important constitutional issue, I think there's no doubt they take it, and they take it in their normal schedule. The question is, do they want to take it in anything like their normal schedule under the circumstances, or because it's a hot potato, do they just basically sidestep it and and without maybe any comment whatsoever, just let the lower court decision stand?
Even not taking it in their normal schedule, if you got through briefing, oral argument, and decision time in 6 weeks, that would be lightning fast for a major Supreme Court decision. Look how long it took the Court of Appeals to act. And in that event, you're still talking about 4 months that you'd have to make up, according to the trial court, in terms of giving Trump time to prepare for trial. And you're still talking about the beginning of August, which makes it very dicey to have a trial.
Yep, I agree. Jill Abramson, do you want to weigh in on this question, the legal part of it or the political part of it? If Jill is unmuted or not.
Okay.
There
yes.
you go. There you
now
go. Jill, go ahead.
My gut is a little bit different from Tom's. I think everything he said makes perfect sense. But I think that the Supreme Court is going to duck and just let the appeals court ruling stand with no comment.
Right. And they could do that in a few days if that's
They
their
could do it.
inclination.
And if they're going to do that, they're going to do it fast.
Yeah. If that happens, Jill, if you're right, and I slightly more agree with Tom, but I don't feel strongly about it. If you're right, they could set a trial date for there'd be nothing standing in the way of setting a trial date for Trump in the next 15, 20, 30 days, right? I mean, they have to get a jury in and all that, but they could begin the process and have a trial date set for March, right?
In the spring.
Yeah.
Yes.
March or April. Okay. Todd Purdom, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Well, no, I don't have any special insight, and I agree with both Tom and Jill. The only thing I'd say is whatever the Supreme Court might do, it's politically freighted. If they take the case, which you'd think they might want to do because, as Tom points out, it's an important constitutional question never fully resolved, that's a political act because it would make a trial all but impossible. If they don't take it, that's a political act too because it makes a trial likely and that could be timely before the election. So I wouldn't want to be Chief Justice Roberts right now on this particular question. I think it's kind of complicated for them, whatever they do.
Yep, I agree with that. Is Mike Barnacle, are you on from the airport? I haven't seen Mike here, but does anybody see if Mike's on? All right, if Mike joins us, we'll do. I want to take a few questions from the community about this topic. We'll get to the media topic in a minute. But if you've got a question about the Supreme Court, about the Court of Appeals ruling for Todd or Jill or Tom or me, or you'd like to make a comment and tell us something ingenious you've thought of, raise your hand. I prefer your electronic hand, easier for me to see. But if you're on camera, you can raise your physical hand. If you've got a question or want to make a comment, now's your opportunity on this topic. We'll get to the press topic in a minute. Anybody have a question, comment they want to make? I'm looking over my shoulder to see what's going on in cable. Joe Biden still hasn't talked. I want to show you one thing while people think about a question. If you guys could put up the fundraising appeal. We're waiting for we know Trump's going to appeal to the Supreme Court. We know the Supreme Court has a few days after it comes in to decide what to do. But I want to show you one thing that has happened. See a hand up. But you guys put up the Trump graphic here, not the headlines, but the fundraising appeal. Donald Trump is already, not surprisingly, because he does this whenever he gets an adverse ruling. I already got this in my inbox about a half an hour ago, not too long after the ruling. It was probably already written. And you can see the familiar language and familiar what it used to call direct mail technique. Stop the witch hunt breaking from President Trump. Ruled against me. I have no immunity. Joe Biden has weaponized the government. Obviously, he'll raise money off of this, and we'll see a lot of this. But again, what's most significant, you can take that down. What's most significant about today to me, even stipulating we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do, is the issue of how quickly now Trump could be at trial, something that I haven't thought was going to happen, but now is in reach. Douglas Workman, who is an esteemed attorney, Douglas, question
Hey,
or comment?
thanks for taking my question. But the question I have is, what has the Supreme Court done to disperse what has the appellate court done to disperse the en banc of the DC Circuit? Because I thought that normally what happens when you get an appeal is that the next step is to go en banc.
They did something that I'm not familiar with, but I'm not a lawyer, and I'm curious if there are lawyers on here who know the answer. They basically did a thing that said you can go en banc, but the clock doesn't stop. The stay of all the proceedings is in place as long as you go to the Supreme Court. But if you go en banc, we're not going to stay it. Now, Trump could appeal that to the Supreme Court and and they could say, no, we're not ready for it. It needs to, if he wants to go to the full Court of Appeals, he can. And we're saying,
Mark,
okay, go ahead, Jill.
I just want to say, I think that is unlikely because the appeals court tilts liberal.
Yeah, well, it's unlikely that they'll rule in his favor, even less likely than the Supreme Court will. But he's about delay. He's not about winning. He's about delay. So if he gets on en banc review, it means it goes on for longer, and that's all he wants.
I don't know the statistics on this, but the likelihood that a panel consisting of 2 Democratic and 1 Republican judge on the DC panel with a per curiam issued opinion has been taken up en banc by the Court of Appeals, I imagine, is extremely small, if ever.
It's small, and it's probably even smaller that they'd rule in his favor. But again, it adds a couple of weeks at least to the process, and that's what he's looking for. William Cole is also an attorney. William Cole is also an attorney, I believe. Mr. Cole, question or comment?
Yes. Has anybody read this opinion enough to tell us how narrow it is? In other words, if the Supreme Court didn't take it up, would that still leave lots of questions available for them to decide in the future with different circumstances? Yeah,
good question. It's pretty sweeping, although it only applies, as I understand it, to the jurisdiction. So it doesn't apply outside, obviously, it doesn't apply outside the DC Circuit. But it's pretty sweeping in its language. I skimmed through it, and I'm not a lawyer. I understand your question. I think the basic answer to your question is it's pretty sweeping. And the Supreme Court wouldn't need to weigh in to have sweeping this again. But obviously, it is a case of first impression involving a pretty massive constitutional issue that has never come up in our history. So I think they did about as much as they could to write a sweeping opinion. It's pretty sweeping, and it's unanimous. It's also unsigned, which is kind of interesting. Anybody else have any questions they want to ask on this or comments they want to make on this before we move on to the other topic? Anybody? All right. While we switch to the other topic, I'm gonna continue to monitor President Biden when he speaks, as well as any other developments in this. But let's go to our topic that we gathered for initially, which is the question I've had to cover this president, former president. As I wrote to all of you in announcing the event, I find this to be really complicated. The question of when to cover him live, when not to cover him live, how to deal with serialized, and as most of you know, I think Joe Biden deserves tougher coverage too. And that's a separate and related question, which I'm sure will come up here organically. But really, it's this unique challenge of how do you cover this particular guy? And I will say the failure to cover him the night of Iowa on his victory speech, the failure to cover a lot of events that would be normally covered for someone of his position is a big symbolic choice that I think is part of this. And so I want to start with Jill, who was nice enough to write a great summary of the history here. And Jill, the last thing you wrote in that message was about context. And I want to challenge you on one thing about your former paper in leading to you and ask you just for your general view of how to put context on him. The New York Times, as you pointed out, has done a great job, Jonathan Swan and others, in writing all about what a Trump second term would be like. Right. I think it's phenomenally telling that they don't seem to have a team doing that about Joe Biden. And so one thing for me about context is, don't they need to also cover Joe Biden tough so they don't create the impression that they're unequal and unfair? Jill.
Yeah, I do not see, a direct proportionality between the two because Biden at this point, I mean, we're having this meeting as, the immigration Israel-Ukraine bill has been just blown to pieces. I mean, it's not his it would be, what would you say about his second term? He can't get a thing through the Congress,
Well,
and
that's pretty telling right in itself. I mean, the Time series sometimes is highly speculative about what Donald Trump would do in a second term. And they cherry pick remarks from advisors, remarks that he makes, kind of stray remarks. Shouldn't we be concerned about what a Biden second term will be like if he's asking for a
we
second
should
term?
definitely be
So why doesn't the
concerned.
Times have 4 people on that?
I'll just stay with what I said.
Yeah.
I don't think there's direct proportionality. I think the Times will do plenty about what Biden would do in a second term. I think why the Times has, with such force, done first the series by Haberman, Swan, and Savage. And Maggie has another piece today. It's all on the theme, which I think is legit, that Trump is all about vengeance, and that he and Stephen Miller and the rest of the crew are not going to waste any time taking vengeance on Trump's perceived enemies. And I think that that's important and worth covering. I think we should also recognize the Atlantic, which has, the full magazine is all about, and I think it's quite good, every kind of issue component of what a second Trump
So
term.
is your bottom line answer of how should Trump be covered is there should be lots and lots of coverage of how dangerous he would be in a second term? Is that your?
I'm not saying lots and lots. I think what the Times has done so far has been pretty superb and well reported. I don't see it as cherry picked the way you do.
All right. Tom Rogers, what would you, if you had the presidents of all the network news divisions in one room and they asked you for advice, how should we cover Trump? What would you tell them?
Well, I think I'd look at both campaigns and how both have gotten very good at rapid response to the other, and say, as news organizations, you got to be equally good at rapid response when it comes to misinformation and lies coming out of either camp. And I say that fully aware of the fact that there's going to be much more of that out of the Trump camp than the Biden camp, but they have to be vigilant about both. And I would come up, if I was a television news organization, with an on-screen bug that flashes and tells people to turn to website or whatever if it's not going to be immediately discussed on air, that corrects lie, corrects misinformation. And I think it would be beyond claims of the candidates. I think I would extend that not only to falsehoods coming out of the candidates themselves, but to AI-generated material that is making scale distribution, which is known by news organizations pretty quickly, and be in a rapid response situation to point that out, since we're going to have a ton of deep fake AI stuff. And thirdly, anything from anywhere that casts doubt on the integrity of the election that is being put out there, be in a position to immediately disabuse it to the extent it's nonsense. I think those three areas are ones that they got to be much, much more vigilant about, calling it out regularly, and giving people the ability to see what's right and what is not.
And how important do you think it is to have quote unquote equitable coverage in terms of live or fact checking, and the style of either simultaneous or immediately after fact checking between Trump and Biden?
Well, I think you got to do it for both if in doing it. But as I said, I think you're going to find that it is far more of an issue in one camp than the other. And if the audiences that may see it may already know that and be predisposed to not take what is said as truthful information. But I think as news organizations, to the extent they're going to present it, they got to be equally vigilant at making sure misinformation, falsehoods are called out.
Right. Okay. Todd Purdom, same question to you. I asked Tom, if you were addressing the political newsrooms of the Washington Post, New York Times, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and they said, Todd, how should we keep from screwing up covering Trump? What would you tell them?
Well, I guess, thanks, Mark. The first thing I'd say is no adverbs and very few adjectives. I mean, I find this, as you say, a very troubling question, one that I don't know the answer to. More than 35 years ago, when I was a young political reporter in New York covering Donald Trump for the New York Times, I mean, Donald Trump was a person you called, if you wanted a zippy, funny quote, Donald Trump was regarded as a joke. And I think one of the reasons that his rise in 2015 was initially misunderstood by institutions like my alma mater, the New York Times, whose coverage and general excellence I admire unstintingly, is that he was regarded as not a threat. He was regarded as a joke, as someone who couldn't really possibly get traction. But now I think too much of the coverage of Trump, every time Trump is covered, Trump is winning. And I don't know how to solve that problem. But there's way too much heavy breathing in the daily coverage of Trump in the so-called mainstream media. And to me, the tone of in another goddamn outrage Donald Trump today did, I just think, tell me what he did. Let me decide what to make of it. Don't lean so heavily on the pedal to tell me with loaded phrases and words how dastardly and disastrous this is. Let me discern that myself. I guess I would say that you should cover Donald Trump with enormous discipline and restraint, and don't let his explosions of the norm divert you from your own mission, really.
That's awesome. Interesting. Is Mike Barnacle on? Mike, are you there? I don't see Mike, but he was at the airport, so he may be not on. All right. Mike, are you there? There you go. Mike, unmute yourself if you would.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you great. Having you live from Logan is pure poetry as far as I'm concerned. Thank you for making time.
Gate 31.
Mike, have you been able to hear the conversation?
I have been. And
All
my
right.
closing remarks as I'm about to board the plane are this. The thing that worries me most about the coverage is the potential for lack of coverage, given the cost of covering something that's going to run 9 months before it gives birth to a final verdict in November. It's got to covering court cases, covering the election itself. This in an era when there are huge print companies, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, laying off reporters. The fact that suburban newspapers no longer exist, mid-market newspapers, they're all suffering. Many of them are losing money. That's the thing that worries me the most, is the actual coverage itself. You almost need two people teams to cover this campaign. You need the straight reporting, and twin it alongside that would be a commentary on what each candidate said the day prior and what it meant, what it means to a reader, what it means to the country. And I don't know that the scope of this campaign coverage, that the cost of it is going to be so exorbitant. I don't know that it's going to be up to the standards that we all expect and that we've all seen in the past.
Do you think that Trump benefits from that dynamic more than Joe Biden does?
Oh, absolutely.
Explain why.
Absolutely.
Explain why.
Well, first of all, he lies all the time. and the lies, while covered, they're muted almost. You need to use the word lie when it applies to Donald Trump. It's a very rarely used word in news stories. You know, it's a declarative sentence. Donald Trump lied yesterday. Just keep telling people what he is doing out there. And I don't think we do that accurately.
You think the news sections, I know you're getting bored, but you think the news sections of major news organizations should say he lied?
Yes. Yeah, because that's what he did.
Yeah, that differs in
I
time.
agree with that.
Go ahead.
The New York Times does use the word lie. Marty Barron at the Washington Post didn't allow it.
Mike, you go when you need to. Thank you for that. So, Todd, you and I disagree with the others. You and I, just sort of broadly, I'm not against calling out lies, but I think it needs to be done on all sides. But Todd, you and I seem to think, if I'm summarizing your view accurately, that we should let the words speak for themselves rather than what Mike and Jill and I think Tom seem to be suggesting, which is you got to go hard at calling him out. Is that?
No, I don't think there's any inconsistency between letting the words speak for themselves and going hard at calling him out. I think those can be done hand in hand. I just think that in the daily reportage of events, I just think there are tonal things. You don't have to have a tone of perpetual outrage and shock. I mean, I think that the quietest coverage speaks the loudest. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't correctly and immediately point out where he has, yes, lied or misstated things. It's just that sometimes there seems to be an almost breathless, gleeful seizing on the latest outrage in a tone of outrage that I think would be more powerful and more persuasive if it were in muted tones.
Yep.
But I don't for 1 second suggest that he shouldn't be held to account. And I also don't think yes, the Biden camp should be held to account too. But as Tom said, and as Jill said, I really don't think there's anything remotely approaching equivalency in how they handle the facts of the situation. I just don't think that there's anything close.
Tom and Jill, thank you, Todd. Tom and Jill, how do you feel about this issue of tone? Is that important to you to get it right?
Tone was always important to me when I was editor of the Times. And I thought Todd's comments about adjectives and adverbs was exactly right. That there is too much, it just jumps out at me as gilding the lily. It's like unnecessary added descriptive verbiage, and it does create the appearance of bias. I really do think so.
Thank you, Jill. I want to ask Mark McKinnon if he wants to comment on what we said so far. Mark, would you like to say something? Glad you're here and you know a lot about this stuff. Wandering back towards camera. Good. Mark, what do you think? I'd particularly be curious to know what you think about this issue of live coverage and whether, the guy's former president, front runner for the nomination, front runner for the presidency, gives his Iowa victory speech and 2 of the 3 cable networks don't cover it.
Well, listen, I've never considered myself a real journalist, and I defer to all the pros here, but I've always been a fan of the kind of live coverage, but the Daniel Dale approach. I like live coverage, and I like live fact streaming along with what I'm seeing. So I think some combination of that presentation works for me.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. 2 things to update you on regarding President Biden and the immigration bill. He said, quote, in his remarks just now, all indications are this bill won't even move forward to the Senate floor. Why? The simple reason, Donald Trump, because Donald Trump thinks it's bad for him politically. We've seen President Biden the last couple of weeks really escalate his mentions of Donald Trump, his invocations of him. That's super direct, and I suspect the point of why he did the press statement he just did, a public statement. And John Cornyn is now a no on proceeding on the bill, which is a big deal. Your questions. If you've got a question or comment about this question of Trump press coverage, I know some of you who are more on the red side of America have put in the comments that you want to talk about Joe Biden's lies, which I'm fully open to, of course. But if you've got a question or a comment on the question of how the press should cover Donald Trump this year, please raise your hand, your physical hand if you'd like on camera, or your electronic hand. Would love to get you all involved in this. And if you've got ideas, we'd love to hear them and we can help spread the word. So if you've got a question or a comment, please raise your hand and let's bring you in. And I'll remind you that is the point of two-way, is to give you a chance to ask people like Tom, Jill, and Todd questions. So again, raise your hand if you've got a question or a comment.
Mark,
Yes, Jill.
can I just babble for a minute?
Jill,
while
you
people
babble till I see a hand go up.
Okay, great. I'll babble.
Or speak eloquently, either way, up to you.
Because I want questions. But I think right now in real time that the press is not driving the point home of how incredibly influential Trump has been in what he's doing in real time. He's getting rid of Ron McDaniel. He's trying to get rid of Mitch McConnell, which could succeed. He did blow up, this bill, although, certainly the House Freedom Caucus was going to blow it up on its own. But he is, a big driving force of what's happening as we're sitting here talking to each other.
You're right.
I don't think the press has really made a big enough point.
I agree. I want to give you an example of something he did the other day. And Todd and Tom, I'd love for you guys to weigh in on this as well. He went on Fox and he said, maybe I'll put a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. Okay. So that would destroy the world economy, and he's not going to do it. But he knows full well that if he said 20%, it wouldn't get that much attention. It didn't get all that much attention in the lot of the press, but it perked up a lot of people's ears, and it got some coverage in like Bloomberg and elsewhere because he's the front runner to be president, and 60% is a crazy number. But he does that because he knows, like saying, shut the border down, ban Muslim immigrants. He knows when he says stuff like that, it's impossible for some not to cover it. And so Todd or Tom or Jill, if you were running a news organization and he said, I'm going to raise tariffs 60% on China imports, would you ignore it? Would you cover it? Would you annotate it? What would you do?
Well, my take on this is it really goes back 70 years to Joe McCarthy. I have in my hand the list of what. So when people make charges, the press still reflexively tends to cover them. And if he's the former president of the United States, and as Jill points out, still incredibly influential, you have to cover him. Forgive this print-centric view, but I used to think that maybe the paper, or you could do it digitally or visually on video, should have some kind of a little daily box in which you took something like this 60% tariff on China and tersely but firmly said why this would be virtually impossible to do, probably wouldn't happen. But he said it, and just note, with the factual buttressing from experts or whatever, how this would be almost impossible to do, and it's probably not real, but he said it anyway. But don't make a page one headline out of it. Don't make a big deal out of it. But note it in a kind of a way that you could then collect and say, here are the daily. We're dealing with this, but again, I don't know how realistic that would be, and I don't know how many people would read it. And the thing that makes me feel that my whole 42 years in this business have been a failure.
Oh, Todd.
Is that that nothing the press seems to do in covering Donald Trump can persuade 70 million Americans of the risks and dangers of this really extraordinary person. I just don't understand that.
And I think that's the problem in not covering it. You don't know what comes out of his mouth that is real and what's hyperbole. And he's such a volatile guy, so unpredictable, with no guardrails whatsoever in a second term. Nobody in the administration, in all likelihood, that's likely to provide the counter pressure that some did in his first administration. So you don't know what is real and what's unreal. And in the absence of covering it, the outrageousness of a lot of that stuff will not get the scrutiny that it deserves, and it needs scrutiny. So I think it's a very tough call. I kind of agree. You can't make banner headlines, front page news out of everything, as Todd says, but it's got to be scrutinized.
He's been doing interviews, mostly with conservative media, but not only. And Joe Biden's not doing interviews very much, including turning down the Super Bowl interview. Is that something that should be covered extensively, or is that a minor point or a non-factor for you in terms of telling voters about these two men?
I'll take a stab.
Go ahead, Jill.
I think it absolutely is a factor, and it's linked to the issue of Biden's energy levels and, his view of what campaigning for president is going to be. I mean, people are writing that he's, quote unquote, laying low right now, and that may be tactical, but it also could be physical. And I'm disappointed at the times Todd and I both fondly remember, as some of the people on this call will, Dr. Larry Altman, who would thoroughly, look into, he did, an amazing deep dive on Cheney's heart that was important and informative and completely factual. He's a respected MD himself.
It's one of the huge.
Why are we not getting that on Biden?
It's and on Trump. It's one of the huge failures. Dr. Altman was unique in his knowledge and his tenacity. Every news organization in the country should have someone like that, a doctor who understands journalism, who's pressing both these campaigns every day. Given their age, given both of them have obvious health issues, not uncommon to people their age. I couldn't agree more, and that's a failure for both of them. Robert Denton, thank you for leading the way with a question or comment.
Well, thank you. And as an academic, look, y'all created, because of the way you are compensated and get money, you created some of this problem yourself.
Yeah.
The idea that you can go beyond this particular bias and partisan, it's not about your content. It's about the eyes who are listening to it. It's the audience that dictates your content. And some of you are sounding, and again, I'm an academic, so I don't know anything, right? You're sounding a little on a high horse on that. You tinge and you're going to have to play to your audience. So there's still, you keep people in their silos. You're preaching to the choir most of the time. And
Robert,
that's
be more specific. I understand generally what you're saying, but be more specific with an example or just a little bit more clarity. What does the press need to do better to address your concern?
Well, it's a real dilemma because you think that the audience of MSNBC would just want to see a factual box, objectivity as a norm or standard of journalism, which obviously is no more per se. You bring people say, I bring my life experiences now to it. And so I'm going to reflect instead of report. I think there's been some blurred lines in terms of the practice of contemporary journalism. And part of that's economic, which is kind of unfortunate, if that makes sense. And especially in the digital world,
But Robert,
I think what Professor
affects
Denton
the
is
left
saying.
and the right, Robert?
I'm sorry?
The economic incentive affects both the red press and the blue press, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think, Mark, that's a really wise point that Professor Denton is making. And because Jill and I came of age in journalism in a time when the coverage of news was largely free of commercial pressures. And publishers could say to advertisers, we're going to wall you off from our newsroom, and we don't really care what you think about the substance of the news. And if you want to cancel your advertisement for Macy's because you don't like what we said about you, we'll survive. Now, institutions like the New York Times, as we've seen in the post-Trump era, the ongoing Trump era, are economically dependent on like-minded readers who pay to subscribe to the New York Times because they think it reflects their worldview. And that's something, it's not new under the sun. It's actually a reversion to the more typical pattern of the press throughout history. But it's definitely changed. It turns out that the paradigm of objective press coverage, which really grew up in America in the aftermath of World War II, and it lasted like 60 years.
Right.
And then Roger Ailes came along and said, we don't need no stinking blue facts. We'll give you the red facts, and the rest is history. So I think that there is a self-reinforcing, and it's part of what I was talking about earlier about the tone of outrage that often colors coverage today. News organizations on both the right and the left, and up to now the right's been more effective, are giving consumers what they want.
Todd, do you think that, I want to get Jen Flinton in with her question in a moment, but I just want to ask you, Todd, do you think that tone of outrage is to sell product, to get clicks and sell papers, or do you think that it's reflective of the editors and the reporters who generate the outrage tone?
I guess I think it's probably some subtle combination of both.
Can I pipe in with
Yes, please, Jill.
a point to buttress what Todd is saying, which is all right? It is that the tone of outrage is driven by social media in large part. It's, it's Facebook and X, Twitter that really was the most heavy factor in infecting the press on both sides with that constant tone of outrage.
Yep.
It's what gets clicks.
Yeah. Jen Flinton, your question, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. So recognizing the fact that cable news stations up until this point have mostly had conservative or Republican commentators on who are either kind of playing the middle road or are either anti-Trump or sort of take the general Republican position. How do you foresee going forward once we are truly in an election year and you have the pro-Biden commentators on who will be unabashedly pro-Biden as expected? How do you foresee some of these cable news stations, but also the big three, ABC, NBC, CBS on Sunday mornings, bringing in those pro-Trump advocates? Well,
I find, Jen, actually, they more often than not have Republicans who are anti-Trump Republicans. I gave the example a few weeks ago. Meet the Press had, their panel was two journalists, one former Democratic state chair of the Iowa Democratic Party and a legislator, and then Mark Short, Mike Pence's former chief of staff, who's an anti-Trump Republican. So I think if you look at MSNBC and CNN, and then, as you said, the broadcast networks, they too often can't find pro-Trump Republicans who they find acceptable. And as you know, some news organizations, television news organizations, have taken the position they won't have anybody on who denies Trump won the election, Biden won the election, and that means no Speaker of the House, for instance. So I think that booking question is extremely tough, and I think it'd be good for America and good for the Trump campaign, both, if there could be a group of people who were acceptable, credible, and representative of the point of view of probably at least 45% of America and maybe up to 48% of America who will support Donald Trump in this election. So
Mark,
I'm less concerned about the question of should there be pro-Trump people. Then we've got to find people with credibility. We can't say that anyone who supports Donald Trump doesn't have the credibility to be on red, blue, or bluish television, I think. Anybody else want to comment on that? Thank you for the question.
I tend to agree with you on that, although in the straight interview parts of the network news shows, they certainly have plenty of congressional representatives who are of the Trump ilk. When it comes to the cable channel stuff with roundtable commentating, et cetera, they tend to lack the Trump viewpoint most of the time. But I really don't think that factor is all that meaningful, because the audiences that are watching those respective channels, whether it's the Fox crowd or the MSNBC crowd, is not going to be significantly changed in any way by what the coverage on those respective channels are. The real issue to me is this is not going to be a two-person race. And I think the dominant media, all media, is guilty more often than not as looking to characterize this as a two-person race. And it will become more clear when we know who gets on what state ballots. But in all likelihood, there are going to be 2, maybe 3 independent candidates here that will have swing state access. And that is going to be a far bigger question, how they are covered, how much coverage they get. Anybody who is of Biden ilk and is getting the MSNBC version of a presidential campaign, huge issue. How much unpaid media are you going to give to third-party candidates, some which may have real resonance, particularly in swing states? And it's very hard for me to believe that is not a much bigger problem for Biden than for Trump. And that kind of coverage is going to be a much bigger editorial issue than the question of whether Trump point of view is represented on MSNBC or a Biden point of view is represented on Fox.
Tom, I agree with you. If they do get ballot access, we'll see if they do. And if they do, we'll do 100 two-way episodes about them. And of course, the coverage is not just do they get their message out, but do they get scrutiny? Because I guarantee you, Bobby Kennedy could get a lot more scrutiny than he's already gotten. I don't want to go over, but I do want Ray and Robert who both were nice enough to put their hands up, to ask their questions. Ray is a great journalist, and Ray, if you could ask your question briefly, and then Robert, you ask your question or comment, and then we'll finish up. It's kind of wrapping them together. Hopefully, they're close enough together that we can. So first Ray, and then Robert, short as you can, please. Ray cannot hear you. So while you figure that out, Robert, what's your question or comment?
My question is, why don't we get a little more about the substance of Trump's positions on these difficult problems, the Mideast, Ukraine? I mean,
all right,
I'm just a reporter.
More of the substance.
But I don't know exactly what he's for.
All right, Robert, thank you for that. Ray, what's your brief question or comment, please? Still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Mark,
yes, go ahead, Ray. Got you now.
Yeah, okay. So here's my quick question. Journalism, by and large, especially in the dominant media, and when it comes to Trump, is not objective anymore. But it still pretends that it's subjective, tries to put that veneer on that coverage. Why doesn't it follow the method of journalism on the right, where they just rip that Band-Aid off. They're all for Trump. We know the dominant media, by and large, is not for Trump. Why not just say it?
Right. That's a great question. Closing comments from each of you. Jill, then Tom, then Todd. You can please try to address those two questions. I'll just say it's hard to cover Trump's policies because he's all over the map. It's difficult. Jill, you first.
I guess I just am not ready to let go of the idea of facts and truth and my worship of those terms and my belief that good reporters who dig and dig and dig can get to them. So the idea that we're just going to surrender to partisan media on both sides is very sad and terrifying.
I'm with you, Jill. Tom, closing comment, please.
I think what media ought to spend a lot more time on is interviewing former Trump administration officials who know this guy, worked with this guy, can talk to his real views on various things and other aspects of his personality and temperament. And I think that will be far more revealing than the press trying to dissect what comes out of Donald Trump's mouth at any given point.
Thank you, Tom. And Todd.
Yeah, those are both excellent points. And despite my earlier comment about feeling like my vocation of 40 years has been a failure, I'm not willing, like Jill, I'm not willing to give up on the ideal that, as you know, Walter Lippmann said, the truth will emerge. The truth can emerge, or a truth, a version of the truth can emerge from the diligent application of repertorial effort to uncover facts, because facts are facts. They're not alternative facts. I mean, they're really immutable, real facts. And I think if we give up on that, we give up on everything. And I'm old, but not yet willing to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jill. Thanks, Mike Barnacle and Mark McKinnon, and all of you who asked questions. Went a little bit over, but not too far over. Grateful to you for making time. Those of you who are interested in this topic, you can bet we're going to continue to talk about it because it's hugely important. And it's the kind of topic that I think doesn't get the kind of balanced attention and discussion in other media. So thank you for making time. Appreciate you being part of Two Way. And we'll be back with more episodes soon, and you'll hear about them in the normal way. Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Again, thanks to Jill, Tom, Todd, and Mike. Have a great day.
Mark.